Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast of around 12 years of ethnographic research where we look into the intersection between autism and Christianity, specifically level 1 autism and the people in internet online subcommunities and how they interact with Christianity and how Christianity interacts with autism and everything in between. And this episode, we are not doing that. This is one of my most requested episodes. So I have been asked by many people to do an episode about the cross correlations and interesting overlaps that there would be between Judaism and autism. Usually by Jewish people who see my work and go, "Oh, this is so interesting. How does this map onto Judaism?" And I go, "It doesn't." Like, I have no idea. I have not done the research. I have not done the analysis. I have not thought about it. And most importantly, I don't have the cultural competence to navigate this. A very common problem in autism research that looks at Christianity or speculates about Christianity is they will understand autism, but they will not understand Christianity. And they will start making assertions that are just wrong, that don't pan out in any of the data. They will selectively sample only specific types of Christians that are not representative of the whole, and they will do all sorts of things that just like, if you actually understood Christianity, you would immediately flag that and go like, no, that's not right. You misunderstood that. And if I try to do that analysis on Judaism, I would do the same thing. I have no interest in doing the same thing. I for all of the analytical flaws that I have, I like to think that one of them that I don't is I'm pretty good at staying in my lane, and Judaism is absolutely not my lane. It is, however, returning guest Etana's lane. You've been on the podcast a few times, so why don't you just reintroduce yourself?
Right. My name's Etana Edelman. I'm an MFA student and occasional Substacker right now, I guess. And my background is as a modern Orthodox Jew. At least that's where I grew up. That's the kind of community I came from. And I'll explain what modern Orthodox Judaism is in a little bit. But just suffice it to say, I grew up observing many aspects of Judaism, such as Shabbos, going to the synagogue every weekend, having a school where prayer was something you did twice a day, keeping kosher obviously is one of the big ones, like observing multiple holidays, most of the holidays, including fast days, and there's a lot of holidays. And I went to basically Jewish day schools until I was about 14. And then for multiple reasons, I had to switch to a public school. And during that time, I became sort of isolated from many aspects of Judaism. But before I did that, I did have a significant I was significantly immersed in Jewish life, in study, whatever as rudimentary as it was for someone who was only a teenager. And I had a bat mitzvah. My family still observant Jews. My siblings are kind of various levels of observant. It's and I will have to explain what observance is, because I think basically my point is just, I have a pretty deep background in Judaism. I can go through. My family has a lot of rabbis in it. I grew up very immersed in it, and I think I have enough understanding to basically talk about at least a lot of it. And I'm sort of in the thing about modern Orthodox Judaism is it's sort of in this weird middle area between the more secular aspects of Judaism and the more religious aspects. And I think it's a good way to, I think it's a good background to talk about this kind of thing.
Yeah. So all of that is to say you certainly have the cultural competence to discuss this subject, but also you specifically have the competence to also understand and discuss autism and more the sort of complicated intersections of these types of things in a way that many people don't always have. You have not, however, embarked on the same program of ethnographic research that I have. So this will be more speculative than other episodes that you're used to hearing on this podcast. But it is such a highly requested episode that I thought, what the hell, let's give it a shot. So before we get into that, I'll explain the data that I have. So I do have some data on Jewish people in my data set. So from the interviews that I've done, 20 out of the 650-ish are various forms of Jewish convert to Christianity. So they started off Jewish in a wide variety of different forms, and then they converted. 20 is not a huge amount. In my survey data, I have 56 Jewish people who converted to Christianity who have answered surveys. I have several converts from Christianity to Judaism in my data set, so I tag these as ex-Christians. So 6 of the people that I've interviewed were Christian and then converted to Judaism, and I have 9 people in my surveys who converted from Christianity to various forms of Judaism. So this is not a deep data set that I have. All of this is to say that I have spoken to a lot of Jewish people about this topic. A lot of them reach out to me, especially since I started the podcast, to be like, hey, can we talk about this? Or like, are you interested in hearing my perspective? And I go, sure, why the hell not? And I talk to them, but I do not have the cultural competence to navigate these conversations. So people are often confused by what I mean by that. So I'll just explain. When I interview a Christian, they will say something like, they sometimes say bizarre things. So they will say things like, well, the Bible was invented at the Council of Nicaea. I know that's not true. And I know that's not Christian doctrine. I know that has no basis in historical reality. And I immediately go, okay, this is a person who has a misunderstanding of their own religious tradition. I can't do that with Judaism. If a person tells me that Maimonides said something, I go, sick. Awesome. and that's about the end of what I can do, right? If someone tells me that like observing Jewish traditions means doing X, I kind of just go, okay, cool. And I have no idea if they are giving me an idiosyncratic understanding of their own tradition, if they're giving me a common understanding, if they're giving me a heretical understanding that has been condemned by the majority of Jewish people. You know, it's all a little confusing for me. So in this data that I've collected, I don't know how much of it is accurate because I don't understand Judaism or the culture particularly well. I probably have significantly more knowledge than your average person, but that's because your average person doesn't know a whole hell of a lot about Judaism. I know about as much as you would know if you took like a Intro to World Religions 101 course. That is about the level of knowledge that I have. And so this is when a convert to Christianity tells me that when they were Jewish, they believed XYZ, and now that they're Christian, they believe XYZ, I go, neat. I can check the Christian facts, but the Jewish ones, I kind of just take them for what they are. That being said, I've noticed a few trends. So converts to Judaism often report very similar things to converts to Eastern Orthodoxy in the West, which is there is one big component that they bring up that no one else tends to bring up, which is ethno-religious tensions. So Judaism has large ethno-religious components to it. So do practices of orthodoxy in the West. And so if you show up to an Orthodox church, it is more likely to be heavily Greek ethno-religious or Russian or Ukrainian or something like that. And those cultural ties matter, and you will often feel like an outsider if you're not from that background. And so the converts to Judaism report similar-ish feelings because they didn't start out as Jewish and then they converted, and then they feel this sort of sense of cultural disconnect. The converts to Christianity which, like I said, this is a very small portion, so don't hang your hat on any of it, often had co-occurring OCD. Um, this is like a
Oh,
weirdly common thing that I see
oh, that makes
in
sense.
the Jewish converts to Christianity, and they get a little like Martin Luther pilled on it, which for those who don't know, because I suspect some
Oh,
people will be listening to this podcast who do not understand the nuances of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther himself probably had some form of OCD or something closely related to it, and was hyper scrupulous and was hyper focused on following the rules and the laws to the letter. And then his rereading of Christianity started to reshape how he saw those religious tensions between what he called law and gospel. And the gospel sets you free from the chains of the law in a lot of places, and it is the good news that saves you from it. And a lot of the people, even though this is not a large sample, a lot of the people who talk about converting from not like secular Judaism, but usually from like practicing form of Judaism, will mention specifically something that goes along the theme of, oh yeah, by the way, I have OCD or OCD like tendencies. And I really liked the aspect of Christianity that was like specifically designed to reinterpret religious scruples as something else. Yeah, they are all, except for one of the 20, Protestant converts. So only one of them converted to Catholicism.
yeah, I get the sense if you are if you have scrupulosity and you are trying to do something about that, you are not going to convert to Catholicism or Orthodoxy.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
for the record, I
Um,
also have very bad OCD, like extremely bad, like probably one of the most debilitating aspects of my mental health. Probably, I can't exactly. It's hard to differentiate it from autism to a certain extent because it's just the nature of the diagnosis. But it, I was lucky not to have scrupulosity, I will say. It just because I can very much see how Judaism can engender that, and I've known people who get really bad OCD over that.
yeah, yeah. So that is just a trend I've noticed in the very small sample set that I have. So don't draw any large conclusions or trends from that.
Hmm.
Small sample set, anecdotal evidence, just an interesting quirk of the data set that I found when I was looking over it. The converts to Judaism, one of the big things that they mentioned that they love is the rules and the structures and the pattern of life. They love that. So that's, I only have like 6 from interviews that I've done, but every single one of them has mentioned how much they like and enjoy these types of structures provided to them
Mm.
by their new religion.
There's
So
a
yeah,
on the holiday of Passover. There's a not sure like there's like an event called the Seder where you sit down and you read from a book called the Haggadah and tell the story of the Exodus. And what it's a very interesting book because it has all these weird passages from like the Talmud and from everything. But one famous section is called the Four Sons, where these allegorical sons, the wise son, the wicked son, the simple son, and the son who doesn't know how to ask, are all they're all asked like these questions and how you respond, and you're told how you're supposed to respond to them. And the wise son asks basically, what are the laws, what are the restrictions, what are the precepts of like of like Judaism and the Seder and Passover. And yeah, the fact that's the sort of thing that the wise son says. I'm
yeah,
sort of resisting the urge to say all this in Hebrew because when I was taught a lot of this, I was taught a lot of this in Hebrew. Like I'm resisting the urge to call the wise son the chacham, and the bad son the rasha. I'm probably going to resist a bunch of urges to say certain things in Hebrew because the way I was taught is to learn a lot of this stuff in like the original language in the Hebrew or the Aramaic or whatever. So if I somehow like drop that into a sentence, that's not me being performative. That is just that's how I was taught.
yeah. Yeah, I will say as a final note, there is a group of Christians who call themselves Messianic Jews.
Mm-hmm.
I just label those as Christians.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
Christians who like
yeah,
who like the trappings of Judaism and want to
yeah,
convert Jews because converting Jews is sort of a,
yeah.
it's a thing.
Yes, I do not consider them Jews. I consider them Christians.
Yeah.
So for my data set, I have interviewed a few of them. They're just Christians. Okay, cool. We've got that out of the way. So, Etana, what is Judaism?
Oh God. Okay. Well, you're asking a question that I think people have been trying to pin down for like maybe 2000 years. I guess to answer that, like you kind of have to like go from at what point did Judaism and Christianity become separate things, because they did not used to be separate things, at least very originally. Like both Judaism and Christianity like sort of stem from Second Temple Judaism, and I'm not going to go into too much of the history, but when we talk about Judaism, we are mostly talking about something called Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is something that develops as the temple is destroyed, as the diaspora gets underway, as, and as a lot of, and most importantly, as a lot of oral law gets written down. So that's different from, say, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah. That stuff is being written down. That is written down earlier. What really distinguishes a lot of Judaism is the fact that what happens is that the oral law, which is initially called like the Mishnah, gets written down, and then there's a ton of commentary on that becomes the Talmud, which is a very complicated thing that I'm going to have to be like referring almost to Wikipedia to a certain extent, despite having learned a lot of this, because there is just so much stuff to like retain. At least in terms of when the oral law was written down, it was sometime around like the second or third, like it started being compiled around the 2nd or 3rd century. And by the time of like the what's the word, like by the 500s, you start getting the Talmud being written down. And the Talmud, if you is something you encounter online a lot, usually as someone saying, I've read the Talmud, and this is what the
No,
Talmud
no, no,
says.
no.
And you haven't read the Talmud. You have read someone taking certain parts of the Talmud, or certain things that might not even be in the Talmud, or that might be in exegeses of the Talmud, or like on commentaries of the Talmud, and has spliced them all into like a 4chan list. And you are telling me you've like, because if you ever look up a page of Talmud, it looks like the book House of Leaves. I don't know if you've read House of Leaves. It is a literal maze. You are cross-referencing, like there's the way the Talmud is structured is you get like a page of Mishnah, which is the initial oral law, and then you get a commentary on that, and then commentaries like on one side and another commentary, and that you keep like referring to. It takes forever to read it can take like a week to read an entire page, and to the point that people have like ceremonies when they finish like a book or a chapter or what. Like it's it's an extremely like rigorous process, and it probably has a lot to do with what we're about to talk about. So anyway, but here's the thing. As much as I'm saying that Judaism, when we're talking about Judaism, we're talking about Rabbinic Judaism, even that's not the whole story, because there are still like portions of sects of Judaism that are very much Judaism that do not read the Talmud, do not consider any of that oral law really part of Judaism. There's Karaite, what the big ones are like Karaite Judaism, and I think a lot of Ethiopian Jews. I think it was called Haymanot. I'm not sure. Yeah, Haymanot is like that's the branch of Judaism that like Ethiopian Jews practice. I could be wrong. I don't know enough about Ethiopian Jews, but yeah, like because of the way Judaism is just structured and so decentralized, it's very hard to get a really good handle on like what is Judaism. Even when it comes to the Talmud, which even if you use like the Talmud and like reading of the Talmud as like an anchoring of Jewish faith, there's more than one Talmud. There's two Talmuds. There's a Babylonian one and a Jerusalem one. And then in the aftermath of like what is the diaspora, of like the increasing movement of Jews into Western Europe, into the Middle East, into all these areas, you get a further splintering of like, you have different what are called halachas, traditions. And how people practice Judaism tends to depend on their community, the halachic, as it's called, practices of each community. And they can be very different from each other. Now, let's skip. I can't go into all this. So I'm going to skip ahead to talk about Maimonides, because that's probably like the closest thing you get to like a principle or a creed. And so basically, in the in like the very early Middle Ages, Maimonides, who was living, I think he was mostly living in like Egypt, working for like the which was like the Ayyubid Sultanate. He put down he formulated 13 principles of faith. And these 13 principles are: there is a God, there is one God, God has no physical body, God is eternal, only God may be worshipped, God communicates with humans, Moses was the greatest of the prophets, Torah comes from God, the Torah is the authentic word of God and may not be changed, God is aware of all our deeds, God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, the Messiah will come, and finally the dead will be resurrected. This has never been regarded as any kind of like, this is just to say that this doesn't define Judaism either, honestly. Like, it would be nice if I could just point to like, okay, this is Maimonides and he set down the creed for all Jews. It doesn't. It's so decentralized, and it's still it's almost impossible to really pinpoint any kind of actual creed. So when it comes to Judaism, I would go with the just idea that Judaism is a bunch of practices. It is observance of what are called mitzvot. A mitzvah is the commandments, and what those commandments are and how you practice them differs. It is prayer, Jewish prayer and liturgy, a lot study, Torah study and Talmud study, and then it is at the more than anything, it is sort of like an ethno-religious just grouping, and that kind of thing is why like it's an ethno-religious grouping more than anything else, I could say, and because of that, it's very difficult to argue that it's creed based, and so you have the practices, but they differ heavily based on based on your family, based on your rabbi, and yeah, that is it. And it's so like you can see, like, I grew up really immersed in this. I'm struggling to define this. I'm struggling to sort of like define Judaism as anything like, and so I end up like falling back on like the ethnic group aspect to it. It's almost easier to do so, because I think Judaism, I think a lot of it has its roots in something that's older than like the modern concept of what religions are, I think. And which is, I think, very Christian, and then maybe very Muslim, and then it gets very hard to like really truly like fully get a sense of it. But
yeah, so one really common problem that Christians make when trying to think about Judaism is they think it's like a peculiar form of Christianity. And it's just not. Like, no. It operates very differently.
If there is one thing that Jews mostly agree on, actually pretty much entirely agree on, it's just that you can't be Jewish and believe in Jesus's divinity. Or that's basically it. That's like one of the one things Judaism, because I forgot to mention a very big aspect of Judaism. It's the avoidance of idol worship. And the thing about idol worship, which it is like, it's in the Bible, they talk about idol worship, but with Judaism, idolatry and idol worship, and again, I am probably only like giving like a segment of what you can consider Judaism, but idolatry and idol worship, you can kind of extend that to a lot of things. And Judaism considers Christianity to be idolatry. It considers Christianity to be idol worship. In some cases, it considers it to be polytheistic. So it has a more complicated relationship with Islam, where there's a lot of other factors and it's probably more ethnically charged. But in terms of what is Judaism, Judaism is just the faith that the beliefs and the practices of the Jewish people. It's frustrating to describe.
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job of describing it.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think is sort of necessary to get into is so you've mentioned a bunch of different groups
Yeah.
of Jewish people. Do you mind giving like a rough sketch of the different schools or forms or types
Yeah.
that exist in the current
Because
day?
I think this is probably really important to understand Judaism. Judaism doesn't have the kind of denominational breakdown that Christianity does, and for most of Jewish history, like after the destruction of the Second Temple, the religion is basically just divided on based on like religion. You have the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the community that consolidated in the Rhineland and moved east into Central and Eastern Europe, and these are the Jews you're most likely to be familiar with in the Western Hemisphere. They constitute a single distinct ethnic group because there was a major founder effect occurring somewhere between 1100 and 1400 AD. And this is why there are so many genetic studies on Ashkenazi Jews, because we're a very homogeneous population. I'm Ashkenazi. And so that's, yeah. This is the group that speaks Yiddish. Or spoke Yiddish. It's the group that, which is, to describe it, it's a German language that's heavily influenced by Biblical Hebrew. Then you have the Sephardic Jews, and they are the community that settled in the Iberian Peninsula, but after the events of 1492, they were dispersed through Europe and the Middle East. They had languages like Yiddish, like Judeo-Spanish, but it is much less, it's very endangered. And Mizrahi, which is kind of a more modern term, and I think it's really mostly comes after the State of Israel was established. It refers to the Jewish groups that lived in the Muslim world before 1492. And now, as I said, there were sectarian groups like the Karaites that didn't believe in the oral law, but for most of its history, Rabbinic Judaism is primarily divided by regional liturgical variations, and denominational breakdown doesn't really get going until about after 1700, because after 1700, there's this period of the aftermath of these messianic claimants turning out to be massive disappointments. You have Shabbatai Tzvi, who ended up having to convert to Islam. I think you have Jacob Frank, who may have preceded him. There were a lot of these just like really big messianic crash outs. And in the aftermath of that, you have this religious revival called Hasidic Judaism. It's a lot like, I think, a lot of the Great Awakenings that affected Christianity. It's in during that kind of similar time period. And it's founded by a Jewish mystic called the Baal Shem Tov. And he stressed the importance of prayer, Kabbalah, which is a kind of Jewish mysticism. And I'm not getting into Kabbalah now, but that is like a whole other route you can go down. So yeah. Torah study, of course, and an almost meditative devotion to God called Dveikut. And the Hasidic Jews eventually developed into these countless dynasties, which were led by spiritual leaders, and these leaders were called Rebbes. And as a result of the Holocaust, the vast majority of these dynasties are now based in either Israel or the US, but they're mostly named after like dynasties from Europe or Eastern Europe, and they dress like they're from Eastern Europe. They're kind of like, at least in the US, if you see them, they're a lot kind of like the urban Amish to a certain extent. They live in enclaves, they work in certain careers, and they keep to themselves. And they don't interact with other Jews much. You can grow up modern Orthodox or Reform or whatever and never interact with a Hasidic Jew. There's one exception, of course, and that's Chabad Lubavitch, which is a school of Hasidic thought that emerged in Lithuania in the 1770s, which combined Hasidic mysticism with the more rational side of Judaism that was being championed by the Lithuanians. And in the aftermath of the Holocaust, their rebbes, whose name was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, transformed the group into a paragon of Jewish outreach. He proselytized to less religious Jews, not non-Jews, just less religious Jews. So a lot of less religious Jews have stories of being on the street in like New York City and someone, a Hasidic Jew, coming up to them and saying, "Oh, you Jewish? You want somewhere to spend Shabbos, to wrap tefillin," which is so there's that's those are Chabad. No other Hasidic Jews do that. Schneerson also kind of developed a cult of personality and is now recognized as the Messiah. So that is awkward, especially for Judaism. A, because we've had bad experiences with messianic movements in Judaism before, and B, because it gets very close to like Christianity. But basically, if you are a non-Hasidic Jew, which I think most Jews are, your main experience with Hasidic Jews will be Chabad Lubavitch Jews. Now, the rest of Judaism really boils down to, like, when it came to this big hippie movement of the 1700s, really did not go unchallenged, and the group that was particularly basically the people who disagreed with Hasidism and who were particularly major opponents of Hasidism were called the Misnagdim. It just means opponents. It's heavily associated with Lithuanian Jewry, and my own ancestor, the Vilna Gaon, that's a name he was called. His real name was Elijah of Vilnius. My dad has all these stories about him, like saying, like, "Oh, he sounds like one of the most autistic men alive." There's so many stories about him, like not like refusing to mourn when his mother died because the Sabbath had started, so he needed to wait until Shabbat ended for him to be able to mourn properly. Like really like crazy stuff, like the way he was very enthusiastically against the Hasidim. My dad my dad was always very proud of being descended from him, and my dad has like a very like antagonistic attitude toward Hasidic Jews as a result. And it is funny because Hasidic Jews are so often like treated as like the image of the Jew, but like it's sort of interesting that they like, there's a really good book called The Chosen, which is about a modern Orthodox Jewish boy, or like an observant Jewish boy who's not Hasidic, and a Hasidic Jewish boy, and this in like the late 40s, who become friends. It's a good way of like getting it's like a young adult book, and it's a really good way of like introducing like the concept of the Hasidic non-Hasidic split. So when it comes to, no one really identifies as a misnagid. I am sorry for like using all these like crazy phrases.
No, you're good.
All right. Basically, because the actual denominational breakdown outside of Hasidim is really the result of something called the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment. It starts in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1770s. It culminates with the development of Jewish nationalism and later Zionism in the 1880s. It leads to the revival of Hebrew, which had previously only been a liturgical language, and much greater interaction with the outside world, and the adoption of modern values. And this is where you actually get a denominational breakdown. And a lot of that comes from the US, because when Jews had to go to the US, you start having to like have denominations in the first place. So the denominations, at least in the US, are basically, you have Orthodoxy, which is a really collective term for the traditionalist branches of Judaism. It's the Jews who keep kosher, who observe the Sabbath strictly, on Friday night and Saturday, and other aspects of the halacha. It's often also used to refer to Hasidim and to ultra-religious Sephardic Jews. But when it comes to like non-Hasidic Ashkenazis, I'll have to split into two groups. One is the Haredi. These are like trad Jews. Their dress style makes them look like Hasidic Jews. But I think the Haredim are usually more likely to be religious Zionists, while the Hasidic Jews have a sort of tradition of anti-Zionism. The Haredi Jews are heavily boosted by what you could basically call born-again Jews. We call them Baal Tshuva, but they're essentially like, this is where you, like, they're essentially less religious Jews who have a sort of, for better lack of a better term, come to, well, I can't say Jesus, come to God moment and become very religious. They're called Baal Tshuva, as I said. The other version is the modern Orthodox. This is the group that I come from. It's dominated by both religious Zionism, which again was not considered a very, initially was considered a very secular movement, and was initially, like, Jews struggled heavily to integrate that with traditional Judaism. It's dumb. So, but religious Zionism is a big part of modern Orthodoxy. And it also involves the synthesis of Jewish values and law with modernity. It's a really unwieldy beast. There isn't really a neat delineation between modern and ultra Orthodox. When I was at these Jewish day schools, I had these ultra Orthodox teachers, or at least I would consider them ultra Orthodox, but I also had much less religious classmates. So that's just like it's a very different, it's, yeah, I'll have to get further into that once I'm done breaking all these denominations down. Then you have Reform Judaism, which, like the Protestant Reformation, which is, I will say, it's older than Orthodoxy, arguably, because Reform Judaism it begins in Germany, like a lot of the other Reformation did. It did away with a lot of the dietary laws and the Sabbath laws, and it switched to an English liturgy. The central motto is like Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. You'll see that in a lot of left-wing circles, people talking about Tikkun Olam. It's the second largest Jewish denomination outside Orthodoxy. It's the largest in the US overall. It's the first Jewish denomination to ordain women as rabbis. Most Jews you meet will probably be Reform. And probably many converts you meet might be, I mean, you seem to have met converts to like more religious forms of Judaism. But I suspect most people who convert, like, it's easier to convert to Reform than it is to convert to Orthodoxy.
Yeah, so most of them that convert to Orthodoxy,
Yeah,
but
but
that's more of a quirk of autism,
yes,
of
that's what I meant.
them going like, I want the real hard
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. When
Yeah.
other people who convert to Judaism who are not autistic, they're probably going to be like converting because they married a Jewish person, and a lot of, or people who are going to be like politically converting, they might convert to Reform. It's not so much that people, like, Reform is just one of the easier things to convert
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
In terms of, there's also something called conservative Judaism, which sort of, it tries to bridge the gap between Reform and Orthodox Judaism. It tries to put a bit more focus on Jewish law, but it's still less strict than Orthodox Judaism. It's kind of similar to modern Orthodoxy. It's just a bit more like egalitarian gender wise. I think it used to be a lot bigger, but I think as modern Orthodoxy modernized, essentially, it shrunk a lot. And then there's other movements like Reconstructionist Judaism, which basically is like Judaism is a civilization, not a religion. It's fairly diverse and it's really hard to describe. And you get so denominational Judaism is kind of a very Western Hemisphere phenomenon. It's not I think you go into, like, if you, I'm not sure how much it really applies to like Europe specifically, where Europe, you'll have like a chief rabbi, and it's more of like, it's this, the communities are smaller, so it's and it's completely different. And then there's a completely different breakdown in Israel, where you have the Haredi and the religious Zionists, and a group called like the traditional Jews, and then the secular Jews. Like, it's the breakdowns get completely different when you get into Israel. So I'm focusing on the US. The thing is, when we talk about like I know you're going to inevitably ask, what's the most autistic
I
denomination?
sure am.
And the thing is, like, I'm probably not going to say a denomination. I'm probably going to say like I'm probably going to say Lithuanian Jews, because like the breakdown is still so ethnocentric, and Lithuania is where you have the opposition to Hasidism, the opposition to that like crazy mystic hippie tradition, and the focus on what my great 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 grandfather was doing. It is probably, but the thing is, you can't. No one is going to say now that they're a Lithuanian Jew unless I guess they're my father, and they'll who's very proud of like the fact that he has Lithuanian Jewish ancestry. But there's this idea of there's these all these regional stereotypes of Jews from, again, we are still mostly talking about Ashkenazi Jews, and there's all these regional stereotypes from Eastern Europe. And the stereotype of the Lithuanian Jew is this very someone who reads a lot of Maimonides, is very rational, is very analytical. That's, I guess, the most autistic type of Jew. And you'll probably find, but the problem is you can find them kind of dispersed through many denominations. um,
Yeah.
so
It's
it's
it's really funny because
yeah.
technically, by proportion, and in my research, the most autistic religious group by proportion are the Lutherans. And so it's the Scandinavian Baltic connection.
Oh yeah, that I think there's
Yeah,
something about that northern area. Like
yeah,
it's
just
just very. It has its own like neurotype, that area.
yeah,
And it's weird because you'd think Jews like are supposed to be like this distinct ethnicity, and like we're supposed to be like, I guess with Ashkenazi Jews, it's supposed to be like a mix of Levantine and Italian, but from going way back. So you'd think we wouldn't have anything in common, but we might.
yeah.
But yeah, I can't really get too much into the genetics of it. All I'll say is that but I'm gonna have to, because basically there's other aspects of Judaism besides the denominations that make it like, and that probably make the association between Judaism and autism stronger. But let me go into like all of the things that are like the reasons you're getting people telling you Judaism is the autistic religion. Like I'll explain, like I'm going to get into like every one of them. The first one of them is probably just the Talmud. Like the Talmud and Talmudic reasoning and everything about Talmud and Torah study, but specifically study of the Talmud, is the most autistic thing alive. The you these stories, like these stories, the these parts of like the way it's taught is it's a very specific type of reasoning. You get a lot of, and it's all this sort of like almost like when you like if you're going to the Talmud expecting like the like the real protocols, the elders of Zion, and the real like secret to Jewish domination, you're going to be disappointed, because most of what you're going to get is arguments about like when exactly does the Sabbath start, and whatever the minutiae of kosher, keeping kosher, and what what there's a holiday called Sukkot, where you build a sukkah, you build a hut in your backyard, and you eat and live in it for 7 days. And there is entire tractates on just how you correctly build that sukkah, that little hut in the backyard. And they will go on endless tangents about just every little possible minutia, and there's a lot of humor to be had from it, and there's a lot of it, but it is like, it is probably one of the big places where you can get like this very autistic sense of like just like perseveration and reasoning, and I can get that. But there's other things besides the Talmud.
So whenever I talk to Jewish people, they often tell me that they think that Judaism is the autism religion,
Yeah.
and largely for that reason. Also, just there are lots of rituals and liturgy involved.
Yes.
Lots of repetition of things over and over and over. You
Constantly.
have things that get like repeated to me are like the practice of moving back and forth while praying. Like how did that become a thing? Like
I
I've
don't
had a
know.
few.
One of the ways that when in more religious, with the way men pray in Judaism, is that they will wrap these leather straps around themselves. There's like a deep pressure aspect to that that's
Yeah.
very appealing, I can see. um
Yep.
and in fact, one of the things the Chabad will do is when they want to get people into Judaism or into more religious Judaism is they'll set up these booths where they show you how to wrap tefillin. That's what it's called, the leather stuff. And yeah, they basically get you in with leather.
Yeah.
But there's the study and the liturgy, and especially the halakha, like the like ritualistic nature of it, because there is so much preparation that goes into like, and like so much work that goes into Judaism, or at least into observant Judaism, where it's understandable why like reform movements started like phasing out some of this stuff, because it's a lot, and it's really hard to like completely sustain if you don't have enough money, if you don't have a good community. It can be very hard. And so that's probably a big reason. Another reason, though, is that like even among secular Jews, there's this idea that Jews as an ethnic group are extremely autistic. And that might have to do with the kind of like, so like Judaism went, at least Ashkenazi Judaism, but Judaism in general went through like a weird selection kind of event, if you could call it that. There was a bottleneck. So a lot of it's a pretty small gene pool. And then because Jews were relegated to certain professions, you end up and you end up sort of like having like a really long tradition of Jews in medicine, finance, yeah, medicine and finance. And then even if you're poor, you're in like these like often like these trades, and just this almost intensely like capitalistic, in just like not in any critical sense, but just like this intense like melding over the centuries for being really hyper competent, like I guess certain careers. I don't know enough about the genetics of it. And it's kind of controversial to talk about the genetics because it gets really into like IQ stuff. You'll get a lot of IQ obsessives going on about the IQs of Ashkenazi Jews. It's complicated because on the one hand, we do have like a really strong emphasis on literacy if you grow up Jewish. And it has Jews kind of had like a really high literacy rates, I think longer than Christianity did, like maybe before, like possibly before the printing press, because Jews had to like, the study of Torah and Talmud was seen as one of the mitzvahs, these things that you have to do to be a good Jew. And that God, that lends itself to like generation after generation of people choosing the smartest, as in like the most well-read and the most nerdiest. I don't know. There's a reason like that there are these like nerd stereotypes associated with Jews and autism stereotypes. And then there's the fact that because Jews are so associated with the medical profession, a lot of the original people who discovered or theorized autism were and are Jews. Like Kanner was a Jew. Grunia Sukareva was Jewish. Asperger was not Jewish, funnily enough, but a lot of people were Jewish. There was let's see, Bettelheim was Jewish, Bernard Rimland was Jewish, Baron Cohen is Jewish. So it's just something that's really, Judaism is because the massive overrepresentation of Jews in the medical profession means that often the people describing autism historically were Jewish. And you often wonder if like that had Oliver Sacks was Jewish, I think, right? Yeah, I think Oliver Sacks is Jewish. Yeah, like you get, and that does make me wonder how much the descriptions of autism are like colored by like I don't know, like concepts of Jewishness. But it's a hard thing to like really get into too much. Like it's a thing I'm sort of scared of getting into because of there's so much like like it's so fraught, the issue of Jews and IQ and anything involving like that kind of like inherent biological nature of a group. Like it's fraught, and it gets you involved, like often like overlaps with a lot of people you don't necessarily always want to be associated with.
Yeah.
uh it's a
Oliver Sacks, by the way, Lithuanian Jew.
Yes, that makes sense. That is
Which, as
it,
we've established, is the definitive subtype for the autism. No, I'm
yeah,
joking.
no. Look. My dad is going to listen to this, and he's going to be very proud if I say that the Lithuanian Jew is like the autistic Jew, because he'll know exactly what that means. And it literally, if you read like the stereotype of the Litvak, you'll get like, oh, that sounds like an autistic person. Like
Yeah.
that is unfortunately, like, it's not a denomination, it's literally from the Baltics. If you're descended from that area, you're associated with it, and it's funny because I think it does color certain like caricatures of Judaism, because there are aspects of Judaism that are not rational and are not dry and very like repetitive. There are very mystical and weird aspects of Judaism. As I've said, Kabbalah is a thing that you can like get lost into. It is Jewish mysticism, and it has its whole thing that I am not prepared to talk about at all. um, you know, but I mean, maybe you can argue that Kabbalah being, has its own autistic nature, because it has all these weird like stations and emanate. I don't know, like but it would be a very different type of autism.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So one other thing that I've noticed, and so this is purely anecdotal. This is
yeah.
just from me talking to a lot of Jewish people when they start asking me about Christianity and autism, and I start describing it, and they start going, "Oh, I never thought that was a thing," or "I didn't realize that was a thing." So one thing in Christianity is doctrinal rigidity and creedal
Mm.
adherence is essential in Christianity. This is like one of the only non-negotiable things. So the only
Uh,
things that really unify Christians is the Nicene Creed. And
okay,
it is,
we don't have that. Like the
yes,
Maimonidean Creed was created in
yeah,
a period where it was created by someone who was living in Egypt and was probably responding to Islamic pressure.
yeah.
So
And so that sucks for autistic people.
yeah.
That is very hard. Adhering to rigid doctrinal orthodoxy is often a massive challenge for autistic people. If you are a listener of this podcast, you are probably aware of the merch that we have. Is just a sticker that says, "I have a somewhat complicated relationship with the Council of Chalcedon." So to explain this joke,
Oh my
to
goodness.
those not familiar with it, this is kind of a joke, but it's actually real, because I ask a question to autistic people saying, "Are you orthodox with a low O?" Meaning, do you adhere to the traditional doctrines asserted by the church? So, like, do you adhere to the creeds and the councils, is usually what that's asking. And a lot of autistic people will answer no. And then when you ask them why, they'll say, like, I have really complicated feelings about the Council of Chalcedon, which is a early Christian council that condemned miaphysitism, which is a
Oh,
specific council,
Christology.
yes, is specific Christology about the nature of Christ
Oh,
and the hypostatic union of the divine and human nature of Christ. And were they separate or two combined inseparable entities? And miaphysitism is saying these are unified, and that was technically condemned as heresy by the Western and Eastern Church, and the only ones who hold to it are Coptic Christians. So, or Coptic Christians or others that fall under the label Oriental Orthodox. And so I ask autistic people, and like many of us have like just a really hard time processing the fact that you are, if you are supposed to be in line with Western Christian doctrine, you are supposed to condemn those who hold to non-Chalcedonian views of Christianity. That is a part of the Christian tradition.
See, I
And
just
they
have
go
to
like, "Oh, I can't do that, so no, I'm not Orthodox." Jewish people
uh,
don't have to deal with this.
no, I mean, it's complicated because, like, you will get like inter-Jewish issues of people saying this person isn't very Jewish enough, this person isn't, like observant, but they'll never be considered not Jewish. They'll just be considered not observant or off the
Yeah,
derech. I mean, I'm considered, the term is off the derech, off the path. I mean, usually that's more of a term you have for like Hasidic Jews who don't follow it, but you never get considered not Jewish. There is no creed you profess. The way you convert to Judaism, if you're a man at least, is to get circumcised and then read a bunch of stuff and do a bunch of things. But the circumcision kind of, at least kind of, it kind of provides a lot of the I guess what the word is, like the energy of like where like the creed is supposed to be. It's you just don't have that. You have like a lot of debates about, like especially with Zionism entering into it. There's a lot of things that become complicated, and Jews do have a concept of heresy. Spinoza was considered was called a heretic, but like we have a tendency to just eventually later on say, oh yeah, but they're still Jewish. Like it's like Jewish, like it's one of those things. Like I think my cousin has this stand up. He was like joking about it being like, it's like you never leave Judaism. So there's no like, and you can, because you're considered part of like a people. And if you're considered part of a people or a nation, you don't there isn't really like an expiration date. Even conversion is not really seen as this spiritual experience so much as, I mean, it is a spiritual experience, but it's also considered as if you're joining a tribe. That's why it's so complicated. It's so much more complicated than in Christianity, because you're not simply professing a faith, you're joining a tribe, you're joining a people, and you have to make a real commitment to that. And it's why
yeah,
intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews is so fraught, even though like you'd think it wouldn't be, because Judaism is matrilineal and all it needs is to be passed down from like but parents still don't want their Jewish daughters marrying non-Jews a lot of the time, because there's this obsession with continuity, and it's all very, and yeah, so you don't have the obsession with creeds. I mean, I do find the whole Christology thing really fascinating, because it does remind me of some Talmudic debates. But the thing with the Talmudic debates is that you just, with the Talmud, you're arguing about, how do I do this, how do I do that, where do I, and like you'll get like a consensus, but even then the consensus is really just whatever your own rabbi says. So that, like, there's so many, like, so much like weird minutia that, like, even within the community that I grew up in, like, there were differences in the way people practiced Judaism. Like, okay, so on Friday night, which is now, and is something like, but on Friday night, the way that is when the Jewish Sabbath starts, and the way that usually starts is before the Sabbath meal. The head of the household is supposed to say a blessing over the wine. It's called kiddush, and the way my family, and specifically like my dad would do it, because he was following someone named Rav Soloveitchik, who was the sort of founder of modern Orthodoxy, I guess you could call him that. But the way my dad would do it is that he would stand. We would all stand for the first parts of the kiddush, and then he would say, like, he would get to a certain line, and then we would all sit for those parts of the kiddush. But then I would go to other people's houses for Sabbath, or and I would see they wouldn't do the same thing. They would stand for the whole thing. And that's like this minor little thing, but it just goes to show how like traditions are like, it's so like so decentralized even in the communities. And some of that is just due to Judaism not really being so dispersed, and not having like a single like governing body until basically Israel. So you don't have any kind of like government that can really call a council and decide, what Judaism is. You don't get a Council of Nicaea. You don't get a Council of, you can only have you can have all these regional variations. You can have, and the whatever governing bodies there are, which there are like court systems, and they usually have to answer to both the Jewish community and also the surrounding non-Jewish community. And part of the reason Israel is such a fascinating and also disturbing thing is that it's such a new concept for Judaism to have that much power and that much state control, and it's kind of wreaks a bit of havoc on the religion to a certain extent. And I'll get into how that affected my upbringing, because my upbringing was almost more disturbed. I almost had more problems with Zionism, I think, than I did with any aspects of Judaism, because it was a lot. I think there are probably Jews who have this experience of feeling like they were raised in a very religious community, but in reality, the big problem for them was still Zionism and not the actual Jewish stuff. I mean, I'll explain in a minute. But I guess I should just go for God, I'm trying to figure out if I should talk first about my own story, because that's probably maybe the best way to do it. But I basically had no problem. Are you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, just to cap off this point,
yeah,
one of the reasons why Jewish people often talk about Judaism being far more the autism religion is because it has that wide space for intellectual diversity in a way that creedal religions like Christianity and Islam don't. It has, so the problems that Christians often report about severe cognitive dissonance with doctrinal issues is not really a thing in the Jewish autistic people that I talk to. Again, I haven't done a broad survey. I don't know, but so anecdotally based.
I assume,
and from what they tell me, it's just there's far more room for argument. There's far more room for debate. It's considered part of the tradition to go back and forth and argue about things.
Arguing is our national sport.
In Christianity, though, arguing is you are potentially threatening the doctrine, which is the thing that's important for you to believe. Or if you argue about something, it's oh, are you leaving the fold because you're now arguing about a central part of our doctrine? That's not a thing really in Judaism.
I will add, it probably might be a bit more of a thing in Hasidic Judaism.
Sure.
Because Hasidic Judaism,
I'm not talking to Hasidic Jews.
Yeah, so. You're not talking to Hasidic Jews. You might be able to get to some because there are people who leave Hasidic Judaism, but odds are, I'm going to guess they might not be mostly autistic people. I feel like people who leave Hasidic Judaism do so for very different reasons. And so it's hard to get a good handle on that. But in terms of non-Hasidic Judaism, yes, you're completely on the mark. There is a lot more room for argument. Arguing is considered a very good thing for the most part in Judaism. And it was something I grew up with. I did not feel I almost struggled to understand atheism, because the thing about my upbringing is I never felt disenchanted with religion. I always saw the religion, at least that I grew up with, I liked a lot of it. I still like it. I like participating in it. It's enjoyable for me. I love Passover, even though you can't eat bread, and there's an immensely long, and then I love that the Seder takes an hour to get to the food, because you have to all go around reading the same the Haggadah over and over again. It's very enjoyable for me, and part of that may be due to autism, because it's just that minutia, the constant doing these things over and over again. But at least from my upbringing, I had two problems with Judaism, and it was not the Talmudic stuff. It was not the ritual stuff. There were two issues. One is the liturgy, and the other was specifically the kind of religious Zionism that I was raised in. Because Zionism does not have the same. People say Zionism is not Judaism, and it's kind of complicated because Zionism clearly comes out of Judaism. But if there's one way Zionism is not Judaism, it's that, at least for most of since the establishment of the State of Israel, increasingly, if you are in a Zionist Jewish community, there is not much debate about it that is tolerated. It is the closest thing to a creed in some communities. And in fact, there have been many like religious scholars who weren't Hasidic who would be Zionist, who criticized it for being almost like a replacement for Judaism and almost its own religion. There's this guy I've been reading, Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was like this Israeli critic. I mean, he wasn't an anti-Zionist, but he was an Israeli and a rabbi, and he was called the conscience of Israel. And, one of the things that he was very critical of was the way Zionism was slowly becoming almost like idolatry to him, a sort of state idolatry. And then, even my dad's rabbi, the one my dad followed, Rav Soloveitchik, who founded modern Orthodoxy and who my dad sort of worshipped, like he read all his books, he loved, he followed him to the letter. But Rav Soloveitchik himself was critical of the way he was both a major proponent of religious Zionism, but also very critical of the way it was practiced in Jewish life, where the veneration of the State of Israel became to feel like its own religion. And as a religion, it's almost very different from Judaism because it wasn't something you could really criticize very much, especially because there was this constant sense of Israel being under attack for most of its history. You get this siege mentality that's even more like Judaism obviously had been under attack to a certain extent for a long time, but that didn't really affect, like, you were still able to, like, as long as you like basically acknowledged you were a Jew, that was sort of like, and maybe practiced the halacha. With Zionism, it's a very weird, and it's a really complicated way that it affected Judaism. And growing up in a Zionist community, which is what I could call, like, because a lot of these modern Orthodox and observant religious communities that aren't Hasidic are very Zionist. It's a very weird double consciousness that you get of, like, it's not just that, like, you're being raised to have to, like, you're to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but also to say the Israeli national anthem, that I could deal with. But it's very criticism of Zionism had to be really, like, couched and was not very tolerated as well. And I think it's why you see so many Jews now getting into, like, anti-Zionist movements more than you see Jews, like, converting to Christianity. Like, it's almost like it. I wouldn't be. Yeah, it's a really complicated thing, and I don't want to, like, make it seem like, oh, Zionism ruined Judaism, because I don't think that's what it is. But it did make it very complicated for me, especially because of Zionism being like this 19th century to 20th century, like, socialist movement that tried to emphasize a sort of, like, racial, like, ethnic renewal. You do get a lot of, like, more emphasis on sports and emphasis on it's a lot of the opposite of some of the, like, Jewish stereotypes of, like, nerdiness and just sitting and reading. It to a certain extent, it was almost like a reaction to this image of the Jew as weak and feminized and just sitting indoors reading. And so I think I really chafed at a lot of the stuff, like at the Israel Day parades. And some of it was because it was just too hot and I was really hypersensitive to the weather. But, like, I chafed at, like, the patriotism towards Israel. I chafed at the emotional response to it, because, like, a lot of the emotional aspects of Judaism, and this is where the liturgy is going to come in, that's where it rubs up against me being autistic, because there's other aspects to Judaism besides the rational, like the rational analytical stuff and the ritual stuff. The liturgical aspect of Judaism is a bit more emotional, and it's where a lot of the emotion and the like creedal, not creedal, but a lot of the faith-based stuff really gets poured into the prayers, the and also there's this concept called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, and it's partly based on the idea that the liturgy of Judaism was often so lachrymose and very self, oh god, what's the word, like, I guess lachrymose is just, I don't know how, like, lachrymose and melancholy, and that affected the way Jews saw our history, because Jewish history is very sad in a lot of ways and very traumatic, but it does get hammered into you when you're Jewish, of the Jewish guilt. There's like, the way people talk about Catholic guilt is very different from what Jewish guilt is, because Jewish guilt is not, you were made, you're a sinner and you've made God unhappy. It's you are not living up to what your ancestors died in Auschwitz for. It's very historical, and it's very based on real actual historical atrocities, and it makes sense, because as a religion that's coping with thousands of years of diaspora, but it's a hard thing to deal with if you're like autistic and you're young and you're not very good with like these emotional displays of like of extreme, like, I remember the one time I went to sleepaway camp, when I was 13. I went to a Jewish sleepaway camp in Pennsylvania, and I don't think I did really well there because, again, undiagnosed autism, major OCD. I had friends there, but like I wasn't in a bunk with anyone who I was like officially a friend with. So I had to like, so I just sort of felt very alienated from everyone. And I was very bad at sports, and I was very bad at, I couldn't even swim very well. And so swimming lessons sucked. There was just so much that I didn't like. But then there was this one time, so there's a fast day in the summer called Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's one of the most, next to Yom Kippur, it's the other big fast day in the Jewish calendar. We have multiple fast days. And it's, I never minded the fast. I don't think I really mind. I mean, maybe I did because it would make me kind of antsy, but I at least don't mind it now. But the thing about that, basically it's supposed to memorialize the destruction of the Second Temple, as well as several other catastrophes in Jewish history. And since it's Jewish history, there's a lot of catastrophes, like going back to, all the way up to the Holocaust. So I was at summer camp for this Tisha B'Av, and we all went to this, like, we spent a good portion of it in like this auditorium where they showed us a video, this really sentimental video of the destruction of the Second Temple, maybe the destruction of the First Temple, and then I think it pivoted right to the Holocaust. Really like lachrymose, overwhelming, like, this is hell, like, this is what the equivalent of like you're going to hell is for Judaism, is teaching you about the Holocaust and teaching you about all the other persecutions. And I guess like culturally, and what was bothered me wasn't the video, like I was like, whatever. I saw all these girls, especially including those girls in my bunk, just crying and sobbing. And I'm 13 years old, and I'm like, the other girls are 13, and I'm like, why are these girls crying? It was
This
yeah.
is so funny because there is a literal, exact, identical parallel
Yeah.
at Christian sleepaway camps.
Oh. Oh no, what is it?
It happens so frequently that I
Yeah.
call it the universal autistic
Oh
experience
god.
of Christianity.
Yeah.
Except it's not like guilt based
Yeah.
around the history of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It's an altar call, come to Jesus moment where like
Oh.
everyone, they play like soft music and they try to like hype everyone's emotions up, and
Yeah.
they like think about your sins and all of
Right.
the bad things that you've done, but Jesus is here to save you. Editing John here, but do you know who doesn't use emotionally charged appeals to try to convince you to do things. That's right. The Against Malaria Foundation, for whom this podcast is doing a fundraiser. If you have enjoyed my work or enjoyed any of the work that I have done, please consider donating, as it genuinely helps motivate me to keep doing this work. We recently passed the 10,000 net goal that I had mentally set for myself, which is crazy. I never thought we would reach that, but yet here we are. Thank you to everyone who has donated. Again, even if it's just a small amount, if anything I've done on this podcast or if any of my work has helped you, please consider sending a donation to that. The link will be in the show notes. Anyway, thank you. Back to the podcast. And you look around and everyone's in tears and bawling their eyes out, and you're just like, what the hell is happening here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is like a universal autistic Christian experience.
Yeah,
it's
so
really funny that there's a Jewish equivalent to that.
Yeah, the problem with the Jewish equivalent is that it's the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's much worse.
So much of my and it kind of sucks because I had other experiences like that revolving around learning about the Holocaust. I don't know, if you're Jewish, you learn about the Holocaust from kindergarten onward, at least in these Jewish schools. And okay, it wasn't just the Holocaust, it was also the destruction of the temple and all these other persecutions. But basically, when I had the most cultic, for all that, I was in this Jewish school up until I was in a Jewish school up until I was 14, and that meant a dual curriculum where you learn English and math and science and social studies and everything, but you also learn Talmud and Torah, and they teach you how to pray, they teach you Hebrew. There was a class in 8th grade though that kind of broke me. We had a Jewish history class, and more than any class in the Jewish day schools, that Jewish history class was the most weirdly cult-like religious feel, almost experience. And the teacher, it was just, I think it was just very much revolving around Jewish misery and Jewish, I just chafed at that. And some people really loved that teacher who was in charge of it. But for whatever reason, maybe because I asked too many questions, I really got on his nerves. And again, most of Judaism is very tolerant of asking a lot of questions. You're supposed to ask a lot of questions. This class, you were not supposed to ask a lot of questions. This class, you are supposed to shut up and listen to what he says. And he tells you about the entire history of Judaism, but according to his more religious sort of oriented structure. And then at the end of the semester, we would have a Holocaust unit, and then it would end with us doing a play about the Holocaust. I'll finish that. This teacher did not like me because I asked too many questions, and maybe I was probably I was extremely pedantic. And the thing was, I was almost I would ask my father would tell me, oh yeah, you're probably right about the way he's wrong. It wasn't like I was rebelling against anyone. I was just, this teacher was, again, what I call a Baal Tshuva. I think he was probably someone who had not been as religious and then became more religious, and so dressed quite religious. These sort of you can call them born agains, and they would, I think he felt like he had a mission to keep us all in Judaism, to keep us from marrying non-Jews, to keep us from going to college and maybe becoming critical of Israel, because that was a big thing, that was a thing that he really didn't want us to do. He started screaming at me. He would start just yelling and screaming at me for saying, for some of the things I was saying. I can't really remember what exactly I said that bothered him so much. I remember getting into really weird pedantic, we got into this very weird cycle where I would get into really pedantic criticisms of him. One time I did one, he was bringing up pedophiles for some reason, and I said, "Oh, a pedophile is actually someone who's attracted to children, not someone who
You
molests." So
did the
like,
ephebophilia thing?
yeah, no, but I didn't do the ephebophilia thing. I did the a pedophile is technically not a child molester thing. Like, I
Okay.
don't know. I That wasn't one of the things that made him so mad. I don't remember. I feel like I've emotionally blocked it out. And I think like but I do just remember him just screaming at me constantly and everyone in the class being like really rigid. And eventually I got kicked out of his class. I got just kicked out of the class entirely. But because I got kicked out of that class, but because that the Holocaust play was supposed to be like the sort of finale of the year, it was sort of mandatory for us to all participate in it. So that should have been fun for me because it was a chance. We were supposed to all get to, like, if you could sign up to write for it, and then we would, like, we would all get cast in it and play it. And it was, I should probably explain what I mean by a Holocaust play because I'm sure this sounds like a very like weird take on like a passion play or something, but basically there was this thing in my school, and I don't know if it's still a thing there. This is again like a middle school. At the end of 8th grade, the students at the end of the Holocaust unit in that class, the students would write and act in a play about an event that happened during the Holocaust. So sometimes it would be like the Sobibor uprising, or like there's many, like the Warsaw Ghetto. There's enough events in the Holocaust that you can like make an entire that you could make this a very long-term program. So for us, we did a play about the St. Louis, the SS St. Louis, which was famous for being that it was a ship full of German Jews that was headed toward the US in the late 30s, and it got turned away, first at Cuba, then at the US, and they all got sent back to mostly England and France. And unfortunately, since France got invaded by the Nazis, a lot of people died because they got sent back. That should have been an interesting experience, but because it was run by the same guy who kicked me out of his class, it wasn't very fun. He rewrote our whole script kind of to just suit his own, needs. And also I got cast as a Nazi, so yeah. In hindsight, it's a bit weird that like you had like Jewish kids playing Nazis, and I don't know, like there is a picture of me on Facebook. If you go on Facebook and you go way back, you will find a picture of me dressed as a Nazi. There's no swastika on my arm, but I am dressed as a Nazi. I am 14 years old, and there's a picture of me as dressed as a Nazi because that's what he cast me as. I don't even remember which Nazi it was. I think it might have been Canaris. It was like a weird tacked on sequence, and I hated it because it had very little to do with the rest of the story. I think they had us reenact the Wannsee conference or something. Like I said, it's I don't know if it, like, you can call it Holocaust fetishism. I don't want to like make light of it because the Holocaust is just one of the most horrible events in human history. But I think that is like really did turn me off of like being a practicing Jew. Just that one guy's insistence on almost like fetishizing it, turning it into his own personal like tribute. It was just like, and it started getting me. The other issues I started having is that as I got older, I became just very like resistant to like praying and going to prayers. With Judaism, you're supposed to pray like like 3 times a day usually. And so for school that meant praying in the morning and praying in the evening. And I would go to, like, by the time I had started high school, I would go to like morning prayers, which are called shacharit. And either I would just sit there and do nothing, or I wouldn't even go there. I would just sit by the lockers and just stare out into space because I didn't want to do it. I couldn't really get into prayer. Like it was the aspect of Judaism I struggled with the hardest, and I ended up
A mere exact parallel with Christianity.
yeah.
Almost everything you've said in the
Yeah,
last like 20 minutes, there is a literal one-to-one
yeah,
Christian equivalent of like youth group or
yeah,
confirmation class being the exact same hell site. Anyway,
yeah.
very
It's
funny.
and it's funny because like I never, because of the way Judaism works, I never considered myself as like not Jewish or less Jewish. I always considered myself and still considered myself extremely Jewish. That's sort of the way. But for a long time I drifted from it. I practiced only what was necessary when I was with my parents, but they stopped because I was having so many issues as a teenager. They like allowed me to stop going to synagogue. I haven't been to a synagogue, I think, since my early 20s. I mean, I'll, and then like I actually recently my sister who was in getting her law degree, she moved back to New York City and she's been going to this synagogue, and I asked her like, hey, can I spend like the Sabbath with you and just go to synagogue with you, because like I wanted to start doing it again, because I felt like I'd finally, by this point in my life, I'd no longer had all these like bad experiences, and I felt like I could handle praying and I could handle being socializing. I think the elements of the synagogue is that it's such a place of socializing, and then a place of this attempt at intense prayer. And the way Jewish prayer goes is that it's also very ritualistic, but in a way that bothered me more than anything else, because there was a lot of sitting up and sitting down and movements, and I was just not very good at moving my body when I was younger. So now I'm actually interested in going back to synagogue, and partly I just want to meet more Jews and interact with people, and I don't know, maybe meet someone to date, like, and have like because I'm my parents kind of want me to date a Jewish guy, but at least my basic it feels like something I would actually enjoy at this point. But it's only now that I'm really feeling like I would like to start doing that again. It took me a really long time to even feel like I want to step into a synagogue again. And I don't know why exactly. I think it's just the way that prayer works. Because I remember seeing people get into it. And Jewish prayer is very like, it's not very communal, I would say. I mean, it can be communal because there's certain portions where the rabbi will say things and everyone will respond. But a lot of it is very silent. And a lot of it is very, you read things to yourself. And I had very bad OCD. And once I started hitting puberty, prayer was kind of a nightmare, because all that would happen was I'd get all these crazy sexual thoughts during prayers. I would get like crazy intrusive thoughts. It was just like, I think that was part of the reason I stopped. I was just stopped because there was no ability to, like, I couldn't do contemplation. I couldn't do any of that. And I also couldn't get emotionally invested anymore, because I was at a point where, like, basically when you're a kid, the way they teach you to pray is they teach you like these nice little songs, and I was happy with that, because like I would just sing the little songs in my head and sing the tunes to the prayers. But then when you get older, they don't teach you any more tunes, and so you just have to like say it and think about it. And because they're teaching you Hebrew, you have to like maybe sometimes start even like contemplating the words. But prayer was just this big hurdle that I couldn't get over. I couldn't do, like, it was too much for me. And that combined in school with the dual curriculum, where you have to have like, you have to have learn two different tracks. That got too impossible by high school. And as a result, I had to go to public school. And I will say that this is probably not an uncommon thing in at least with modern Orthodox Judaism, because the schools are so rigorous and so invested in getting you to succeed. They don't often have a lot of room for people with disabilities. I not completely, but they, at least when I was growing up, there just wasn't a lot of room for like someone like me. They didn't know how to handle me, and I was like offloaded onto public school, which I think a lot of it. I'm not the only person in my community who felt like they were sort of offloaded onto public school because the private school. I mean, it might just be the aspect of just private school in general, where they don't necessarily have to follow the ADA as much entirely. Yeah. So that was like a whole bunch of issues, different ones. But I think there were like aspects. Yeah. Now,
It is just so funny how everything you've mentioned so far, I'm like, oh, I recognize that exact pattern
I know.
in the
I
Christian
know.
autistics.
It's
Sort of uncanny.
it's uncanny because like when you talk about Judaism on paper, it's nothing like Christianity. It's like it seems so opposite to it, but because it's a religious community, you get actually a lot of major parallels. It's just in things that people don't necessarily
Yeah.
assume.
Well, the parallel is with doctrinal inflexibility,
Yeah,
right? It's resistance to doctrinal inflexibility and the
yeah,
inability to conform to inflexible doctrine on specific things.
yeah,
One thing, I don't know how to fit it into this podcast,
yeah.
but I want to ask you about it because it's come
Uh-huh.
up a few times in my conversations with people. I think you've also mentioned it. Is there an autism birthright trip?
Yes, I went on that.
Okay,
I
can you
was about
explain
to
what that is?
explain that story. Okay, so birthright, as most people know, is the it's it's a program. It's a program to get Jews more invested in Israel and more connected to Israel. It's like I think it's free. I'm not exactly sure about the details of it, but you get it, you get a free trip to Israel. They, they do a lot of stuff. A lot of it is kind of they want you to date and marry Jews, but a lot of it is also just so that you can be like emotionally connected to Israel. So there is an autism program, or at least there was. I went when I was 20. I was 20 and I'd had to drop out of my first attempt at college, and as a result I was very isolated. And I had in college I had finally started like having male attention, and I kind of wanted that again. I wasn't getting that in, I was now in community college and I was very isolated. So even though I was kind of like very by that point extremely on the fence about Israel and Zionism and a lot of what I've been raised in, I signed up for that. It was a very interesting experience for me because the autism birthright trip, at least when I did it, this was 2014, it was really heavily gender skewed toward men. So I was one of, let's see, there was me, Zach. I was one of like six or seven women, like around 18 to, I don't know, like exactly what it, probably 18 to 20 something. There were a lot more men. It was fun because that was the most male attention I'd gotten in ever. And I met someone who later became my boyfriend because of that, which is kind of I think a lot of the goal of the trip. But it wasn't like a long trip. And there were, I think, things that they steered us away from. Like when you read about a lot of the birthright trips, sometimes they'll go to clubs, they'll do things like that. I don't think we did that. Like we didn't do any of that. They took us to some very interesting places in Israel. They took us all over. They took us to the north to see where like the fighting was going. So we could see that from like just from like a hilltop. That was a weirdly memorable experience. I remember going to Rabin Square, and like it was probably one of the most depressing moments of my life, was like depressing moments of the trip, because the guide was just talking about like the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and like just saying, oh yeah, it sort of killed peace. And like it was like, god, that was like that was just so depressing. But we also, because it was like an autism trip, like it was a bit more like it was a bit more like, I guess, supervised. I remember they took us to the Deaf Museum in Israel, which was really interesting. They also took us to this like autism, what's the word? It was like a residential center for people with autism, I think. And not like low functioning, but like high, mostly high functioning. I like think like I don't know if it was particularly geared toward any one form of autism. Because I remember we met this like very amiable autistic guy who lived there, and was talking about things, and like wanted to show us the way like autism is treated in Israel. And that was also where I got my first kiss. Not up on the trip, like in that center, because we went outside, and basically, okay, so basically, while they were showing us this like like a tour of this like residential center, there was this one guy who was like sneaking around, like asking a bunch of girls like for if he could like write their name down or something. I don't know. And at the end of the tour, like we went outside, And he walked up to me and said, "Hey, can you write me your name?" And I don't know why I did. I was like, I wrote my name down, and then he told me to close my eyes, and he kissed me. And that was my first kiss. That was an interesting experience. I had no idea how to process that. My only way of processing that was that I kissed someone else on the trip consensually that same night. So, and then I met someone else on that trip who became like my boyfriend. So, you know, most of my memories of that trip are basically like almost like a sexual awakening, if you could call it that. It was like a very delayed one, but like it,
From a sexual awakening on the autism birthright trip.
yeah, it's
That sounds like a young adult novel.
yeah, it does sound like a young adult novel. It,
Or fan
you know, it,
fiction. Fan
yeah,
fiction for
I've,
sure.
I've,
Probably on
I've been on
AO3.
I'd been on dates before. I just hadn't kissed anyone. So that was my first kiss and my first consensual kiss, and my first non-consensual kiss. It was in general like the longest lasting effect was just having like a boyfriend who I was sort of like mostly long distance with before it had finally managed to make it physical. But like the whole thing, it was a good experience and it was a good trip. I don't think it did much to make me very like committed to Zionism or Israel. In fact, like I said, it was kind of depressing. Like it was depressing seeing people beg, like this woman at the Independence Hall beg us to understand. No one, we don't want this. We don't want this conflict. Like it was just depressing, like parts of it. And people will go late nowadays will say, "Oh, I went on Birthright and I saw blah 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 blah, like all this horrible stuff." Like, no, you didn't. If you went on Birthright, you didn't see the bad stuff that you're seeing now. You saw what they wanted you to see. But I can also understand how you could go on Birthright and be disillusioned because Israel is a real country. It's not a paradise. It's not a fantasy. It's a real, actual place with real people. And when you go there, you're going to be disappointed if you haven't been there, like if you've only been there maybe once or twice before, and if you've never been there, and you have had this hyped up as Jewish Disneyland or Jewish Fantasyland, and you see it and it's filled with people, many of whom are traumatized, people who are, like this, give your there's all these soldiers everywhere. Like you're seeing it as a very flawed place because it's a place. And that I think I'm glad I did it, but I don't know, I'm sure it was very helpful for like my development as a person who wanted to socialize and do things, but I don't think it did very much to like keep me in the Jewish community. What eventually did like get me back was just learning to socialize better, learning to cope better. And by the time of my late 20s, especially after going through the pandemic, wanting to be with people. So now I'm at a point where I'm wanting to go back to synagogue and I want to be part of the community again. And it has had little to do with like that trip did not really that trip in many ways I think almost like made things worse for a while. Like
It's really funny because
yeah.
there's an exact parallel with
Okay.
autistic Christians as well.
All right, what is it? I want to
Like
know.
so disillusionment with the faith
Yeah,
in teens, young
yeah,
adulthood, and then slow return back in your late
right,
20s, early 30s.
yeah,
It's most reconverts to Christianity. So I specifically track reconverts who started
yeah.
Christian, deconverted, and then reconverted. Usually deconvert like 18 to 22,
Uh-huh.
and then reconvert 28 to 35.
Yeah.
um, anyway,
That so
yeah,
with Judaism there is no, because there's no
yeah,
deconversion, reconversion, you're not going to get people saying that, but you will probably get people who have that experience of just just going away from it. And again, the term, if you search the term off the derech, derech, you will probably find people describing themselves as that, and you may find people who are talking about finding their way back, but they probably won't describe it that way. A lot of it is just that like the way these things are described, or the terminology is just very different, but it is a very similar experience. I think what's interesting to me was that like the whole Gaza conflict, ironically, I think made me more almost closer to Judaism, because I wanted to be like, I felt like I was not surprised by the events of October 7th because I'd been immersed in like reading all this criticism and reading everything about it for a long time. A lot of people in my community were very surprised, but I was not. And I don't think I reacted very well because I didn't have that kind of surprise, like horror shock. How could this happen? Like I was like, this seemed very inevitable to me, which is a horrible thing to say to people who have just gone through that, but or even seen people go through that. I'm sure I lost people I'm related to during that period. I wouldn't know them, but I'm sure I have many relatives there. But as a result, I became more invested in writing about Judaism, and I was starting to be in my I'd started my MFA program. I started, trying to write screenplays about my experience with Judaism, and that led me to reading more about it and being more interested in it. And what was interesting is that starting to feel more free to criticize Israel also made me more defensive of it because I again, this is probably just, you're probably going to have to like cut some of this stuff out because some of this is probably crazy controversial, because like at the same time,
no, we're keeping it all in.
But like, at least for me, once I felt like I was now allowed to just sort of say randomly, yeah, I have these issues with Israel, like once I was allowed to get all like the anger and stuff out about it, I suddenly started to feel more like connected to it. I became interested in Israel because it's a fascinating place. Like it is an extremely fascinating country when you actually
Happens with
see it.
Christians as well.
Yeah. It is, but it is a fascinating. It's fascinating to me, and at the same time, I also understand every sort of aspect of like the controversy and things that are going on, and then I will say, like, I think maybe like Elon buying Twitter is when anti-Semitism started being like really crazy on Twitter. I didn't really see that in the like initial, but maybe my parents would have seen it that way because like, I guess the way people define anti-Semitism is kind of like, it can be kind of subjective. But my point is, maybe the whole issue with October 7th and the crisis around Israel and Jews and Zionism, that made me more interested in it. But that also just might be like by with just the time it happened, because I'm just at a point in my life where I feel like I can participate in this stuff more, where I don't feel like it's too hard for me or too impossible, and I want more community. And I felt like I lost a lot of community when I became distant from it, because part of the big upside about the Jewish community for me was that I think it's part of the reason I don't think I got diagnosed, because I think it was a tight knit community, and I think I kind of was able to coast on the goodwill of a lot of girls, a lot of like programs for like doing things, at least until adolescence. I was able to sort of, I guess, seemingly function. So, but again, the thing is, with my experience, part of the reason like I think you're getting a lot of similarities to your experience and to other Christians' experiences, because the community I come from was like a specifically more observant community. And I think once you get to a level of like observance, you're going to get more of a common experiences. I don't know what this podcast would be like if I were a Reformed Jew who maybe just had a bat mitzvah and that's it. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it might be very different, and it might be very because again, my experience is, to a Reformed Jew, I sound like I was raised in a cult. To a Hasidic Jew, I sound like I'm a heretic. So it's a very it's a very,
Similar
yeah.
similar process to me trying to explain to people that I was conservative evangelical.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, weirdly uncanny. But yeah, the autistic guy leaves Catholicism and then develops like an intense interest in Catholicism as a sociological phenomena is like a super common type of guy, and then eventually ends up going back to mass just because they like everything you described. I'm like, I have seen 100 Christians do this exact trajectory, just with their version of Christianity. So
Yeah.
this is all very interesting.
I think with
Yeah.
Judaism, that's like just such a common thing with Judaism where because you don't what's because you don't
I
speak.
think that's just a common pattern,
Yeah,
honestly,
it
in just
is
like
a common
people, not
pattern of
just autistic
religions.
people. Yeah.
But I will say, because the history of Judaism is often kind of about a lot of like there's so many people who are like leave Judaism and then become fascinated by it, being like, I don't know. Again, I think it's one of those things where it's difficult to know exactly how to really, if I'm actually saying, oh, this is different, or if I'm doing the thing where, oh, we ethnic culture, we like food and family, and and that those are very important things to our culture. Like it's hard to know exactly how to describe once you're getting to the level of this is like an ethnocultural group, because there is a lot of like, our culture likes family unlike every other
Yes. Yeah,
that
yeah.
yeah.
So I think this is a good place to cap it off. This has been
Okay.
a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
We are almost at the 2 hour mark though. So I'll cut it here. Thank
Okay.
you very much for coming on. I have learned that religious autistic Jews who were raised observant have some shocking parallels with
Yes.
autistic Christians, just about slightly different things, but the same
Yeah.
broader overall pattern is still there in like even with like the emotional resonance dissonance. That's really funny. So yeah, it was great having you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Where can the good people of this podcast find you?
So at this point, you can find me on Twitter at Etana Rachel. You can find me on Substack, also at Etana Rachel. I am too lazy to come up with like a euphemism or like an online name, because my name is kind of unique enough that I don't think I need one. like I think there's certain people who still think my name is just Rachel, because it's not a common first name, Etana.
Yeah. Yeah, you can find me at Christianity on Blue Sky, on Twitter, and on Substack. You can also find me at Dispatches from the Autism Wars on Substack. You can donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, which I'll put a link in the description. We have a Discord. You can join the Discord.
Oh, you have a
You can
Discord.
email me.
I didn't
We
know you
do.
had a Discord.
You can. Do you want to
Yeah.
be in the Discord?
Yes,
We
of course I
recently
want to
were
be in the
arguing
Discord.
about Israel.
Oh no. Okay, that's I'm always game for that.
And I was unhelpfully commenting, "That's not how military intelligence analysis collection works." You were making an assumption about the intelligence collection process, which isn't quite accurate, and you're conflating different intelligence program collection sequences. You're conflating defense with an offensive maneuver. These are very different things running in different programs and different silos. Completely misread the tone of the conversation, but it's all good. Yeah, so that we do have a Discord. You could join the Discord. If you send me a message, I will send you a link. If you want to contact me, christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com by email. That is that. Oh, we also have a merch store that I keep forgetting to add. So if you would like your own religious, not spiritual sticker, or a sticker claiming that you have a complicated relationship with the Council of Chalcedon, we have those. You can get them. All right, that is all. See you later.
See you.